The wind howled, a desolate sound tearing across the plains, rattling the single pane of glass in the cabin window. Elara huddled closer to the meager fire, the flames casting dancing, insufficient warmth against the persistent chill that seeped through the log walls. Outside, the world was a canvas of white and gray snow piled high, the sky heavy with the promise of more. Her hands, chapped and raw despite the fire, trembled slightly as she nursed a tin cup of weak tea. It had been 2 days since the blizzard began in earnest, trapping her in this isolated speck of existence. 2 days since she found him. He lay on the floor in the far corner, wrapped in the heaviest blankets she possessed, his breathing shallow and ragged. An Apache. Shot. She hadn't seen the wagon tracks, hadn't heard the shots over the wind until it was too late. He had crawled, bleeding, almost to her doorstep before collapsing. Finding him had been a shock, a jolt of fear and panic that still clawed at her throat. But seeing the wound, the life draining from him, had stirred something else, a flicker of shared humanity she hadn't expected. Not for one seen as the enemy. Compassion, a dangerous luxury in this harsh land, had overridden the ingrained fear. She couldn't leave a wounded man, any wounded man, to freeze and bleed out. So she had dragged him inside, a monumental task for her slight frame, bandaged the wound clumsily with strips of torn linen, and tried to force water past his lips. He remained unconscious, a silent, imposing presence in her small home. His face, even in stillness, was carved with the resilience of the wild land outside. War paint, or what remained of it, smudged on his cheekbones, a single feather woven into his dark hair. He was the embodiment of everything she had been taught to fear, yet here he was vulnerable, relying on her mercy. Fear warred with a grim determination. If anyone found out, the judgment would be swift and brutal. No white woman, alone on the frontier, was meant to offer aid to an Apache, least of all a warrior. They would call it treason, call her a traitor, or worse. The whispers in the nearest settlement, already quick to judge her solitude, would turn venomous, deafening. She was already an outsider, a widow who hadn't remarried, choosing this solitary existence over pity or unwanted proposals. This would be the final exile. She watched him, the rise and fall of his chest. His skin was a shade she rarely saw, his features sharp, unfamiliar. He carried the scent of smoke, leather, and the cold wind. He was a trespasser in her life, a dangerous secret, yet his presence filled the cabin, pushing back the crushing loneliness she usually felt. The silence wasn't just her own anymore. It was shared with a stranger, an enemy, dependent on her actions. The snow continued to fall, a relentless white curtain isolating her further, binding her fate to the silent man on the floor. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that the moment the snow melted, her secret would be exposed, and her life, already precarious, would shatter. The waiting was the hardest part, the anticipation of the inevitable discovery hanging over her like the heavy sky. The blizzard broke on the 3rd day, the sun emerging weak and watery over the pristine white landscape. Elara felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. With the clear skies would come visitors, or at least the chance of them. Trappers, maybe, or someone from the settlement checking on the furthest out cabins. She couldn't move him, couldn't hide him outside. He was still too weak, though his breathing was steadier, less shallow. He had opened his eyes once, dark and unfathomable, before drifting back into unconsciousness. The sound of wagon wheels crunching through the thawing snow was like a hammer blow. Elara froze, her eyes darting to the figure on the floor, then to the door. No time to think, to hide. She smoothed her apron, took a steadying breath she didn't feel, and opened the door before they could knock. It was Jedediah, the circuit preacher, accompanied by Thomas, the blacksmith, and Old Man Hemlock. Their faces, weathered and grim, held an air of suspicion that immediately made her skin crawl. They hadn't come just to check on her. Elara. Jedediah's voice was low, accusatory, carrying the weight of judgment even before the words formed. We saw tracks lead in to your place after the storm broke. Strange tracks. And folks been sayin' things. She tried to keep her voice level, her hands from shaking. Just weathering the storm, Jedediah. Nothin' amiss. But Thomas, younger and more aggressive, pushed past her, his eyes scanning the single room. He spotted him instantly, the dark shape on the floor, the blankets. A gasp escaped him, harsh and loud in the quiet cabin. Apache! Hemlock rasped, his face contorting into a mask of fear and rage. You hidin' an Apache, Alara? Jedediah's gaze, usually filled with stern righteousness, turned to ice. In God's name, woman, what have you done? The questions came fast, overlapping, fueled by fear and prejudice. Is he hurt? Did he force his way in? Are you harmed? But underlying the false concern was the true accusation, unspoken but screaming in their eyes. How could you? Alara stood taller, defiance rising through her fear. He was wounded, on my land. I couldn't leave him to die. Couldn't leave him? Jedediah scoffed, the sound sharp with disgust. He's a savage. He kills our people. He was dying, she repeated, her voice gaining strength. He is still barely alive. Thomas kicked lightly at the blankets covering the warrior's leg. Looks like he's alive enough to be hiding out with a white woman. His insinuation was vile, sickening. Jedediah stepped forward, his voice dropping to a cold, official tone. Alara, this is a grave matter. Hiding an enemy. Consorting, he paused, his eyes flicking between her face and the silent figure on the floor. The weight of his thoughts was palpable. The scandal, the implication given her solitary state, the need to maintain order and the rigid social code of the frontier. There is only one way to prevent utter ruin for you, and to answer for this situation. Alara stared at him, a dawning horror unfolding. What are you talking about? If he lives, Jedediah stated, his gaze unwavering. And if there was any impropriety or even the appearance of it, and given you brought him into your home, the law and the Lord's law demands restitution and protection for the community's good name. He gestured towards the warrior with a stiff hand. You will marry him. By the authority invested in me, I will perform the ceremony immediately, should he regain consciousness and be able to stand. If he recovers, you will be bound to him. The words hung in the air, impossible, surreal. Marry him, the unconscious Apache stranger she had saved? As punishment, as salvation? The blood drained from Alara's face. Her choice, an act of simple human decency, had been twisted into a sin, and the penance was to bind her life to a man she didn't know, couldn't communicate with, and who was, by all accounts, her enemy. The silence in the cabin was suddenly thick with the finality of the decree. She looked at the faces of the three men, saw the cold certainty there, and knew there was no appeal. The days that followed were a blur of grim reality. The warrior, Kalen, as she later learned his name was through gestures and a few halting, unexpected English words, slowly recovered. His eyes, dark and intelligent, watched her constantly, assessing, silent. The men from the settlement left, promising to return when he was stronger, when the ceremony could take place. They left her alone with him, the weight of their judgment heavy in the air even after they were gone. Living with Kalen was a study in silence and unspoken understanding. He moved with a quiet grace, his injured leg still slowing him. He spoke little, responding mostly with nods or brief, guttural sounds. Communication was a struggle, a frustrating dance of gestures and basic words. He watched how she performed her chores, how she tended the small fire, how she rationed the meager supplies. She watched him in return, fascinated and wary. She saw the controlled power in his frame, the deep intelligence in his eyes, the way his gaze seemed to take in everything, missing nothing. The cabin, once her sanctuary of solitude, now felt crowded, charged with his presence. They shared meals in silence, the only sounds the crackling fire and the wind outside. He ate the simple food she prepared without comment, his movements economical. He never touched her, never threatened her. Yet his sheer existence in her space was a constant reminder of the forced bond looming over them. The community's ostracization was immediate and absolute. No one visited. No one traded with her. She was cut off, an island in the white landscape, with only the silent Apache for company. The isolation, once her choice, was now a cage shared with her captor by circumstance. One evening, tending his wound, she accidentally brushed his hand. He didn't flinch, but his dark eyes met hers, and for a fraction of a second, she saw something beyond the stoic warrior facade, a flicker of weariness, perhaps even a question. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the familiar reserve. As he grew stronger, he began to contribute in small ways. He noticed the leaky roof and, using pieces of salvaged bark and his own knowledge, patched it more effectively than she ever could have. He saw her struggle chopping wood and, taking the axe with a silent gesture, split a pile in minutes with powerful, efficient strokes. He didn't ask for permission, just did. These small acts, practical and necessary, chipped away at the wall of fear and resentment she had built around him. He wasn't the savage the settlement warned of. He was a man, capable and self-possessed. An enemy, yes, by definition, but not a monster. He taught her simple words in his language, pointing to objects. Fire, water, sky. She taught him English words in return. Cabin, snow, woman. These exchanges were brief, functional, yet they were bridges across the vast cultural chasm separating them. The forced marriage still loomed, a dark cloud, but sharing her space, sharing silence, sharing the small acts of survival had irrevocably changed the stranger in her home. She still feared the ceremony, the binding of their lives under duress, but the man she would be forced to marry was no longer just an abstract Apache. He was Kalen, and that made all the difference and no difference at all in the eyes of the world outside their cabin. The day the men from the settlement returned felt like an execution. The snow had melted considerably, the trail clear. They arrived not with a preacher this time, but with the town's magistrate, a stern-faced man named Mr. Harrison, and a few other prominent figures, their faces set with grim determination. They were here to ensure the forced marriage took place, to formalize the scandal and, in their minds, contain it. Kalen was standing when they entered, leaning slightly on a makeshift crutch he had carved. He was still thinner than he should be, but his presence filled the cabin. His eyes, calm and steady, met the hostile gazes of the townsmen without flinching. He understood enough of their intent now. Alara stood beside him, her heart pounding, but a strange sense of calm had settled over her. This was happening. There was no escape. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat, his voice booming in the small space. Alara, you have been found harboring an enemy combatant. While your initial claim of finding him wounded is noted, your subsequent actions, harboring him in your home, alone, have created a situation unacceptable to this community. To prevent further disruption and maintain order, and according to the laws governing such interactions on the frontier, this union will proceed. He looked at Kalen. Do you understand? You are to take this woman as your wife. Kalen's gaze shifted to Alara. He looked at her face, etched with apprehension but also a quiet resolve he hadn't seen before. He nodded slowly, a single, deliberate movement. Mr. Harrison seemed surprised by the compliance, but pressed on. And you, Alara? Do you take this man? Alara looked at Kalen. She saw the weeks of shared silence, the small acts of unspoken help, the wary respect that had grown between them not from choice, but necessity. She saw the injustice of the situation, the absurdity of being forced into a marriage as punishment for compassion. But she also saw a chance, a twisted, unconventional chance, to redefine her life on her own terms, away from their judgment. I do, she said, her voice clear and steady. The magistrate performed the ceremony quickly, his words dry and devoid of warmth. It was a transaction, a legal formality designed to contain a problem. When it was over, they were declared husband and wife. There was no kiss, no embrace, Just the silence of the cabin and the heavy presence of the townsman, watching. "The cabin is small, but it's yours," Mr. Harrison said stiffly. "You will remain here. You are married now. You will conduct yourselves as such. Any further trouble, any attempts to flee will be met with the full force of the law." It was a clear warning. You are bound and you are watched. They filed out, leaving Alara and Kalen alone in the cabin, now irrevocably changed. The silence that descended was different this time. It wasn't just the absence of others. It was the beginning of a shared quiet, a mutual assessment of their new reality. They stood awkwardly, facing each other across the hearth that had sheltered them. The forced words hung in the air, a fragile tether binding two disparate lives. It was a marriage built on coercion, fear, and the rigid demands of a prejudiced society. It was not love, not even affection, but it was a bond nonetheless, forged in isolation and hardship. Alara looked at Kalen, saw the same unspoken questions in his eyes that mirrored her own. What now? The world had cast them out, together. In this small cabin, against the vast, indifferent landscape, they were left to forge a life from the ruins of their separate pasts, bound not by choice, but by the inescapable consequences of a single act of mercy. The world outside the cabin remained hostile. The settlement ignored them, save for the occasional rider who would pass by without looking, a silent reinforcement of their exile. The harsh judgment had bound Alara to Kalen, but it had also, inadvertently, severed her ties to the people who had cast her out. In the shared silence of the cabin, a different kind of life began to take shape. They were husband and wife by decree, a title that felt strange and unwieldy, but living together necessitated a new rhythm. Kalen's wound healed fully, leaving him with a slight stiffness but restoring his quiet strength. He moved about the cabin and the surrounding land with a competence born of a life lived outdoors. He helped with chores instinctively, repairing tools, teaching Alara how to identify edible plants she'd overlooked, showing her how to track small game. Alara, in turn, continued to provide food and shelter, patiently teaching him more English words, listening when he offered the rare glimpse into his world through broken phrases and gestures. They learned each other's habits. Kalen's need for solitude at dawn, Alara's preference for working in the afternoon sun. They learned each other's fears. Alara's quiet dread of the long winters, Kalen's subtle vigilance towards distant riders on the horizon. Trust wasn't a conscious decision. It was built in small, unconscious ways. A shared glance when the wind rattled the window just so, a simultaneous movement towards the door at an unfamiliar sound, the quiet understanding that they relied on each other for survival. There were no grand declarations, no moments of sudden clarity. Their connection was subterranean, growing like roots in dry soil, slow, difficult but resilient. Alara found herself watching him not with fear, but with a burgeoning respect. He was resourceful, disciplined, and carried himself with a dignity that transcended the circumstances of their union. Kalen watched Alara, saw her quiet strength, her determination, her surprising resilience in the face of utter rejection. He saw that she did not complain, did not curse her fate aloud, but simply endured, adapted, and continued to live. One cold evening, a group of drunken men from the settlement rode up to the cabin, shouting obscenities, throwing rocks, demanding Kalen show himself. Fear, sharp and cold, pierced through Alara. But before she could react, Kalen was at the door, not with a weapon, but simply standing in the frame, his arms crossed, his expression utterly devoid of fear, radiating a calm, implacable strength. The men, fueled by liquor and bravado but faced with quiet, unwavering power, faltered. After more shouting and threats, they eventually rode away, their taunts fading into the night. Alara stood behind Kalen, her hands trembling. When the sounds of their horses were gone, she looked up at him. "They hate us," she whispered, stating the obvious truth of their existence. Kalen turned, his dark eyes meeting hers in the dim light of the cabin. He reached out a hand, hesitant, and gently touched her arm. It was the first time he had initiated physical contact beyond necessity. They hate, he said, his English still halting but clear. We live. In that simple statement, Alara heard a philosophy honed by survival, a resilience that echoed her own buried strength. They were not defined by the world's hatred, but by their continued existence, together. The forced marriage had been intended as her ruin, her punishment. But in cutting her off, in forcing her into this strange, silent partnership, the settlement had inadvertently given her a freedom she hadn't known she craved. Freedom from their judgment, freedom to build a life not dictated by their narrow rules, but by the shared necessity and quiet understanding between two people deemed outsiders. Her transformation was complete not in finding rescue, but in finding the strength, with this unexpected partner, to simply live, defiantly and with quiet dignity, against a world that wished them gone. They were bound by circumstance, but they were surviving by choice, together.